Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and this is going to be an interesting video. So, about a couple weeks ago, I made a review for Candela Obscura. It had just released in its full release, and I figured I'd hop on as soon as I can to review it because, I figured a lot of people would be looking into it. And when I did the review, honestly, I looked over it and I thought it was a pretty good game, honestly. Like, it's a rules-light game, and that's not particularly my wheelhouse, but there's a lot of good things I could see in it. Plus, the book was beautifully, designed. There were so many great art pieces. I love what they did with the world section. I was pretty happy. And my review, while a bit on the long side, also can double as like a guide, which, I thought was great. The fact that I could cover a game so completely in about 40 minutes felt really good. Anyone who watched that video would knew exactly what they were getting into, or so I thought. So after that, I just kind of, I was done. Candela Obscura was an interesting game. I wanted to try it out for myself and actually play it for a little bit, and otherwise it just was business as usual. Then I saw on Twitter Indestructible's tweet about being very nervous about releasing a new video about his review of Candela Obscura, and I thought this was interesting at the time because I was like, you know, like I can understand the fear, right? When you have such a rabid, well, it's not even a rabid fan base. Critical Role's fan base is as rabid as it is like any other fan base where people get a little bit too into it, and it just gets amplified by size, obviously. The bigger a fan base is, the more you're just going to have very rabid fans. So I thought that was a very legitimate concern. And he was making it sound like he has a very negative viewpoint, and I was very interested to see what it was. So I eventually did come around to watch it, and I it was not a great review, honestly. In my opinion, it was not a great review. And I know there's some people out there who disagree with me, but many of the people I talked to about the review, who I had watched the review before I said anything about it, also said it just wasn't a really good review. Now, not to say that there wasn't anything of value in the piece. In fact, I actually agreed with some of his criticisms, like the whole not talking about mental illness, but still going into mental disfigurement, and like some of the preachiness in the book, which I can see there's a little bit in my opinion, but obviously he took it a lot more. But the problem was, as a review, it really didn't talk much about the game. It went loosely over how the dice work. It mentioned the gilded dice system. It mentioned loosely the circle, even though he didn't go into any explanation of what a circle actually is or what it does. He loosely talked about how what a class is, or it's a role and a specialty, even though he didn't really talk about much of that is. He didn't really go into the setting at all, other than a broad sweeping statement at the beginning that it is a cosmic horror, investigator, secret society based RPG, which I guess is enough for a, back of the book read, but it's not anything I would look for in a review. And overall, I disagreed, and it seemed very biased, and it seemed like he had a very big bone to pick with the creators of the game, stating that they were dunking on Blades in the Dark and Vossen or whatever for their refusal to go into harder concepts, and outwardly stating in some sections that they kind of abhor the idea of using mental illness and the like as a gamified part of a game. And while I can see a little bit of that, it was such a biased take. I never got any of that. Many of the people I spoke to didn't really get any of that, and I just, I felt compelled to leave a comment, and it didn't go well, to say the least. I left a comment best I could, stating my opinions and my the things I critiqued about the video. Well, Taryn responded, kind of. He pretty much just dismissed everything I said out of hand, and we had a bit of a tiff. It went on for a few posts, and I would say communications broke down, but there weren't communications to begin with. Honestly, it's a very regrettably negative experience, and I did my best to try to get something out of it. I wanted to, I asked clarifying questions. I stated clearly what I thought and my thoughts on the system or things that were missed or whatever, but nothing was elaborated on. Many points were just skipped over, and I didn't get anything out of it. And in the end, after everything was said and done, I just left. I was just done. I just was like, well, people are entitled to their opinions, and it's not like there wasn't some value to be had in the video. I just don't. I wouldn't have called it a review. It's anything really but a review. But that's just my own personal opinion, and that's again where I kind of left it. Then very recently, I started to see some negative comments on my Candela Obscura video. And this is the thing, I never assume I'm right about anything. I'll argue, sure, I'll defend my point when I think I need to, but I'm never sure I'm right. And ever since the interaction with Indestructiboy, I had it in the back of my mind of just like, okay, I feel like something is there, right? I feel like I'm missing something. I couldn't find what it was. The video did very poorly to actually describe to me what the problems were, and I didn't feel like it was something I could at least fully dismiss. And with people coming into the comments and giving their negative takes, even though those takes were even less substantive than the video, I decided to take another look, and I read the Polygon review, or the Polygon blog post about it, which was also pretty negative and also very weird in some places. There's this part here which I actually needed to. I spoke to some friends of mine to help them kind of explain to me, because I didn't understand what they were trying to say in this piece. Like, honestly, I'm not going to claim myself to be the smartest person, so I asked for help, and I said, what does this couple sentences say? And it says the game's primary conceit is also similar to Blades in the Dark. But it's like it's similar, but then it goes immediately into describing how one is about playing a criminal gang in a haunted city, and the other is about being in a secret organization protecting the world from occult threats, which is, I would say, two very different ideas. And in addition to this, it says instead of going on jobs, you're sent on assignments that provide episodic adventures. You then spend downtime recovering, training, and building up your base of operations. Now, I can see where the end part here is saying that they're similar, more or less. That they are both kind of episodic, designed to be one to two sessions per mission slash assignments, and then afterwards you're done. You're going to go into downtime, you recover, do whatever. And I agree, but the whole point of a TTRPG is to perform the role of some person in some setting, right? There's a very stark difference between being a bunch of gang members who are out to make a big score, in a haunted city, no less, and one where you're playing as a part of a organization that's secret and is trying to protect people from the supernatural. And I mean, like, there are other monster hunting types of TTRPGs, sure, but I still feel like there are some key differences between, how Candela Obscura and other systems do it. So again, the the Polygon piece was not particularly good, and there's actually another section at the very end where they're stating that the world feels barely described, and there are no real answers to the mysteries presented in the metaplot. Without those tools, it's really up to the game master to flesh out a session into something engaging and scary rather than a bland supernatural procedural. That might make for a great way for the Critical Role crew to show off their acting talents, but it doesn't seem as useful for someone who just wants to run a game at home with their friends. And this part, I think, again, both Indestructiboy's review and Polygon's, blog post about it they feel very biased. Like, for some reason, Candela Obscura is designed more for streaming purposes than it is for, actual like TTRPG play, which, like, I don't understand this idea that you need to understand the meta plot in order to understand like how to run a game, and like Yeah, of course the GM is the one who determines whether each session is actually like an interesting horror, you know, assignment, I guess, or if it's just going to be some procedural, like, what monster of the week are we playing now? Which, that's a very interesting point that I'm going to touch on a bit later. There were, again, some parts of the Polygon review that I did feel were valid in many ways. And I mean, again, how can I not think this is a somewhat biased take when it says Critical Role's Candela Obscura is but a pale shadow of its inspiration, Blades in the Dark? That seems to me very, like they have a point to make. It seems very biased, and it's something that I I this is something that's been echoed. I've seen many comments, I read many Reddit threads that said similar things without actually providing any actual evidence towards it. My first clue as to what people were actually talking about was found in this section here. It says character archetypes are also similar across both games, comparing it to Blades in the Dark, though Candela Obscura gives each of its primary options a pair of specialties, rather than just an overarching role. A face can be a magician or a journalist, and while the slink can be a detective or while this slink can be a detective or a criminal. Now, this makes it easier to give characters highly specific abilities, like a detective's mind palace, which allows them to get clues from the game master by piecing information together, but it also feels as though it railroads players into a narrow set of conceptual options. Now, the next paragraph after this really doesn't touch on this anymore. Instead, just going into how Candela Obscura is a softer version of Blades in the Dark, which, I think some people can argue about, but, I'll agree, not even for the sake of argument. I'll say that Candela Obscura definitely does not have a as much of a deadliness as some other games in its genre, and I think that is fine. But this part here was what clued me into what people were thinking, that and it is something I kind of agreed with. I was like, yeah, I kind of get that. Where you have a super specialized role, and while you can take moves from both your role and your specialty, you're still kind of locked into that one section. There's no like multi-classing or anything like that. Though there are kind of ways that you can get around this with how you distribute your stats, and as well how you guild some of your dice, which definitely can motivate your character to act in different ways than maybe their role or specialty are intended. Regardless, I got it. This is where I started to kind of like piece together some of the information. That's when I came up to this article. This review here on comicbook.com, a review by Christian Hoffer, was exactly what I have been looking for this entire time. What feels like an honest to goodness review of a game that is very unbiased and gives the benefit of the doubt to the system. Not that it needs it overly so, but this is where I started to really understand what people were talking about. More specifically, in the section where they start talking about some of the key differences between how Candela Obscura and Blades in the Dark work, since it's its nearest comparison. It's over the course of the next couple paragraphs that they begin to kind of describe how there are some differences, not only in the tone of the setting, but also in just how each game approaches. And I mean, that makes sense, of course. Candela Obscura is very much narratively designed to be different than Blades in the Dark. You're playing characters with very different ideas and very different goals in mind. This is why you would buy a different game after all. Now, it's this paragraph that made everything make sense to me. He says here, my main issue with Candela Obscura's core rulebook is that the underlying rule set feels remarkably thin compared to the deep world of the game. The game engine feels like a streamlined adaptation of Blades in the Dark's rule set, one that serves well for a relatively contained narrative arc, but will struggle in a longer campaign length format. It's telling that Critical Role has promoted the Candela Obscura game with 3-session chapters, because I don't think the game lends itself to a longer campaigns. While Blades in the Dark had systems in place to keep players invested in growing in their crew's prestige and notoriety, the system doesn't exist within Candela Obscura, and thus the advancement system feels a bit lacking as a result. A strong GM and passionate storyteller can work around the shortcomings of the game engine, likely through the use of different characters, as the Candela Obscura game system can be quite deadly, but the game engine doesn't really have much for players to explore, even compared to other narrative games. Additionally, I feel like the 10 subclasses are a bit limited in what they can do, furthering the idea of shorter campaigns to prevent players from feeling like their character is growing mechanically stale. So, this made everything click. This is where I feel like a lot of the general complaints are taken care of. Now, obviously, in Destructiboy's review, there was obviously a lot more ill, assumptions he made on the design and intent by the writers. But for the most part, what I think Polygon was talking about, what I think many of the other reviews and comments out there, and this is the point where, like, I get it. I get what people have been talking about this whole time. I think I even understand the and agree to some part that, yeah, Candle Obscura, when you look at like the progression and everything else, is very kind of limited in scope. There isn't a lot for the players to actively progress other than the narrative. And this is where I think the biggest divergence is for a majority of people who are looking at Candela Obscura. And so I'm going to get into my breakdown of what I think people were expecting versus kind of what is presented, and why I think that while people are right to, dislike Candela Obscura, I definitely don't think it's a bad game. But before I do, if you like this video, leave a like. Or if you disagree with anything I've said here, go and leave a dislike and give me a comment in the description below, or a description in the comments below. And, I may answer it, I may not. I'm not going to honestly entertain every single person. But if I feel like what you have to say is legitimate enough, I'll answer it. And maybe that's very hypocritical to say. But I'm not at least going to go into the comments to tell you you're wrong and not back anything else I say. So, if I don't feel the need to respond, I just won't do so. Maybe that's a dig. I don't know. Like I said, that particular situation just burned me really bad. But at least I'm being honest about it, right? And I'm definitely, again, open to criticism. And why I'm making this whole video in the first place is because I do feel like, honestly, I missed something in my review. While I said my review was very comprehensive and you can get everything you need to know from it, I think there are some parts that are missing. Obviously, like, Indestructible Boy is very right when he says it's very weird for the game to talk about mental illness but not to talk about physical disabilities in the same weight. And I can also understand his and Polygon's kind of idea of the hyper sanitized setting where there's no bigotry in the setting, there's no harmful social elements really. The worst thing that really happens is a little bit of government corruption and the implication that a war has happened, but it's not really designed in the game for the players to have to really deal with any kind of, overt bigotry, prejudice, discretion, or the like. More of the concern is with the supernatural. And while I definitely think it's fine, I definitely understand some people's concern with that. I think actually, and to speak on some of the comments I received as well, one person mentioned that it's ridiculous to give a $40 game for what barely feels like a game, and it feels like a cash grab, which I don't understand how it would be a cash grab. If it was a cash grab, it would just be a D&D 5e port. But regardless, it's there. I think there's some value to that statement, right? A rules light game is inherently light when it comes to mechanics. And while that definitely is not always the case, and there's obviously varying degrees, obviously when people looked at Blades in the Dark or Vossen, they felt there's more of a mechanical relevance and heft to the system that adds to the narrative rather than detracts. And I can honestly say as well, Candela Obscura's removal and streamlining of the system does not really add much to the story. There's also complaints other people have said that it's a very GM-centric kind of game, where other games like Blades in the Dark or other narrative games that have been coming out lately are much more promote players to make parts of the story, where players get to have more in the say and it becomes more of a collaborative story and narrative rather than just a game run by the GM. And again, I completely understand that for sure. That's something that I think is very valid and a reason why you would pick another game over Candela Obscura. If you don't want the jam to be the final arbiter and to have full control, that's okay. And I feel like if you want something that feels more like a collaborative game, I think that's very valid for sure. With the limited scope of the game, with its somewhat hyper sanitized setting, and with a lot of elements missing from horror that a lot of people like, I can understand why Candela Obscura is a bad game for many people. And there's a lot of people that put a lot of emphasis on this one because it's Critical Role, and I feel like a lot of people are very concerned that people who are more casual or just entering into the TTRPG field will see Candela Obscura and expect that same kind of sanitization, that same kind of feel for other games, or they just feel like it's not a very great showing of what the horror TTRPG scene has. And there's parts of that I agree with and parts of that I disagree with. I definitely think that there is a place for a much safer, space in the horror TTRPG scene. Not everything in the horror TTRPG scene needs to be so gritty. Like one of the hallmarks of horror is that it's uncomfortable. And this takes many forms, whether it's talking about the unknown, monstrosities, something that we just cannot understand or makes us feel like prey. And there's definitely parts of horror as well that dives into the psychological, dealing with the flaws in humanity and even the idea of like being trapped in one's own body due to some kind of mental illness are all very strong hallmarks of horror. And I think that's very accurate to say. But that doesn't mean that everyone needs to go down that route. If you just want to play a game where you're fighting monsters, scary looking monsters, I mean, this image here comes from Candela Obscura, and this is definitely a horrifying thing. There's also talks about how in the setting there's this thing called bleed that can, mutate people, give them magical corruptions and affliction, and that can be taken in a lot of different kinds of ways. But I do feel like having a space where people can experience horror in a much tamer and safer way in a setting that is very much more sanitized has value. I feel that. And the great part about TTRPGs is that you can make the game as gritty as you want. Yeah, sure, the book says don't talk about mental illness, yada yada yada, or the setting doesn't have bigotry, you can just add those. That's just TTRPGs. The thing that with the final part from Polygon's review of like it's just the DM deciding like what happens, and that's not great. Like that's just tabletop in general. That's like D&D, Pathfinder, whatever. People like the idea that the game needs to properly write out for you adventures or stuff like that you don't have to have any creative process to make a good setting versus a bad setting is ludicrous, especially in the age of D&D 5e, which is one of the most homebrewed probably versions of D&D to date, that has people making their own homebrew settings, doing all this kind of stuff. Like so much of that is so homebrewed, and that's just kind of one of the hallmarks of TTRPGs, of someone going in, making their own setting, doing all kinds of really cool things with them, that it's ludicrous to think that a game needs to actually provide everything for you. And there's a lot of people that, think that what Candela Obscura has is a full-fledged setting that is pretty deep. And while I think people can argue about that, and well, I definitely don't think it's the deepest setting that I've ever read personally. I think that this game offers more than enough for the imagination to go off of to create your own interesting adventures. So, like, when it comes to talking about what this game offers as far as horror, I definitely agree that it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. It's a lot safer than people want, and there's people out there who are going to, very rigorously, I wouldn't even say like zealously, defends the grotesqueness of horror and the unsafeness of horror, because that's what makes horror horror, right? Is danger. but there, I again, that there's people who think Minecraft is scary. There's people who get very anxious playing Minecraft, right? There has to be a gradient, and I think Candela Obscura fills a part of that gradient very well. And I think I think setting wise and with rules dictate and everything, I think it can suit a fair number of people. Yeah, sure, the setting might not be as gritty as you want, and I think that's completely valid to say too. Again, different strokes for different folks. People can enjoy different parts of it. When it comes to the game mechanics, this is something that I just was thrown off by completely. One of the reasons why I struggled so much to see why people kept saying it was an incomplete system and all kinds of stuff was, one, no one ever actually explained why it's incomplete. And two, I play Monster of the Week. I've been in a Monster of the Week game for the last like 6 months plus. And Monster of the Week is very much a very bare bones kind of game. It gives you a essentially like a role, and you can pick up powers in that. And I'm getting to the end of my character's progression here, about 6 months in, and that's, I think, fine. There are ways that you can go beyond it. I know in Monster of the Week you can switch playbooks to another playbook, but you get to keep some of the features from your old playbook to represent a change in your character. But what if your character doesn't change? What if your character plays very like close to the playbook that they're in? Progression starts capping off really fast. And this whole idea of a negativity around short campaigns is something that I just don't agree with completely. Like, yeah, sure, one of the great things about TTRPGs is that you can play them as much as your imagination allows. If you can find value in creating another character to go through the setting in another way, that's great. But I don't think every TTRPG needs to be infinite. I don't think every TTRPG even needs to be played, you know, a ton. Like, it's okay to pick up a book and play it for, a couple months and then be done with it. I think that's completely valid. And people complain about the price point, and well, $40 I do think is a little bit on the high end. On TTRPG drive through or drive through RPG, you can find the PDF for $20. Though it does have the $40 with a cross through it, so I don't know if this is a sale or anything. I couldn't find anything on this. If the PDF jumps back up to $40, yeah, I think that's a little bit much, but for $20, I think this is fine for a game that is not designed necessarily to be very long running. And I think that's kind of the point of Candle Obscura. I think in many ways it was designed with the intent. It's very pick up and go. You have assignments that you can play whenever you have the time to, and then you can easily put the book down without any major commitment to a campaign. I think that deserves a place in the TTRPG space too. Not every game needs to be multi-year, you know. Even recently I've started going through, and we're doing about 10 to 15 sessions for different seasons of some of the games we play, so that in between those seasons we can play another 10 to 15 sessions of another game to try it out, a game that, is not necessarily our favorite but one to try out. And I feel this works really well, and I feel like too many people play super long campaigns that in the end never go anywhere because it's a major time commitment. Having any time commitment of a regularly scheduled event that lasts for years is nearly impossible for anyone to maintain fully. Yeah, it does happen, and I'm actually not saying it's impossible. That's hyperbole, but still, it's something that is very difficult. Lives change. People, progress in their life. They go to school, make a family, start a career, move, do all kinds of things that just throw a wrench in the works. And I've had many games just end because life changed, The idea of the forever campaign, or even just a multi-year long campaign, just is not as appealing as it used to be because it's just much harder to maintain. And the one thing I hate more than anything is leaving a story left unfinished. You know what I mean? So, yeah, Candela Obscura is a very episodic, when you have time for, safe horror TTRPG that is as gritty as you want it to be, as you are the creators of your games after all, but the book does not force that essentially onto the setting. And it allows people to engage with it at a level that many feel comfortable. And whether you like this, whether you agree with this or not, I mean, that's just really not up to you, is it? What level of grit is necessary? You can dislike it, sure. And I think that's very valid. I think it's very valid for many of the criticisms people have with the system. I honestly don't think I could play Candela Obscura for much more than, my standard 10 to 15 sessions. And I think that's okay. But I get it. In the end, I understand why everyone had so much issue with Candela Obscura. For many people in the TTRPG space, there's this concern of over casualization of people who are coming in and changing TTRPGs in a way that a lot of people don't like. And while I definitely don't agree that that is happening, TTRPGs has always been a very wide and dynamic space that people have engaged with to varying degrees ever since, they started out, and even in the golden age of the 90s. People just need to understand that, like, a big casual crowd is never a bad thing. If people come in and buy your favorite TTRPG, look at it a little bit and put it on a shelf and never play it, that's still revenue that your favorite company gets added to its shelf. If Candela Obscura brings more people into the light TTRPG scene, all the better. So many people have so many ties to D&D 5e nowadays that it's hard, I feel like, for people to understand how actually diverse and dynamic TTRPGs can be. And if Candela Obscura is their introduction to light systems, where then they can go forward and look for games that are more fleshed out, that's fine. It's a good introductory to it. I think it's like a good, you start the game off with basic equipment and then you find better equipment style of TTRPG. I don't think that Candela Obscura is better than Blades in the Dark. I definitely don't think it's better than Boston. It's not even in my top 5 games. But I still think it's a good game. I think it performs what it wants very well. And I feel like there is some value to be had from this general idea and IP. Who cares if it uses the same system as Blades in the Dark? Even that was iterated upon before and iterated upon before that. Like, that's just a very dumb thing to say. And John Harper himself has gone on to say that he fully supports what Darrington Press has done with Candela Obscura. I think a lot of this is, in one part, there I think are some very general and legitimate concerns about the game and why it's not a good game, and I think that's fair. But I think there's a lot of people who are also just scared of change in the TTRPG scene when change has been happening forever now. Needlessly so, it doesn't affect their home games at all. And I think there's also a lot of people who just hate Critical Role because Critical Role is not their version of TTRPGs. And they feel somewhat threatened despite the Critical Role members not really wanting to take the space from anyone and just trying to do their own thing. It's it's a very multifaceted problem. And Candela Obscura is a game, period. The amount of hate it gets is only due to its popularity. If it wasn't Critical Role's game, no one would be talking about it. And I think that statement speaks more about the situation than anything. Yeah, sure, it would still probably have some negative reviews. Sure. But people would not be making big articles about it. Polygon wouldn't care if it came out and it wasn't under Critical Role's name. And that, I think, is the biggest part. So if you enjoy Candela Obscura, enjoy it for as long as it lasts for you. Get as much out of it as you want and put it on the shelf. That's okay. There's tons of TTRPGs that I have on my shelf that I've either never touched or haven't touched in a long time, and that's okay. The idea that anyone should play a game for years and years to validate that purchase is ridiculous. And just the sake of owning something, I think, is just as valid as anything else. But that's my opinion. Like I said, I'll take any critiques down in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you want to see more kind of videos like this where I go in-depth discussions on TTRPGs in general or coverage of games, go ahead and subscribe. And yeah, that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.